Some people spend their whole lives chasing a reward, but the rarest souls are the ones who quietly walk away from it. No one inside Beaumont Global headquarters expected the old janitor to say no. The polished marble lobby shimmered beneath towering walls of glass as television cameras gathered near the grand staircase, executives whispered behind tailored suits, and assistants hurried from one side of the room to the other carrying folders that suddenly seemed unimportant. At the center of it all stood Charlotte Beaumont, the 33-year-old daughter of billionaire industrialist Richard Beaumont. Elegant without trying, confident without speaking loudly, she held a black leather case containing a certified check worth $1 million. Every eye in the building followed her as she stepped toward the man wearing a faded Navy maintenance uniform with a name tag that simply read Ethan Walker. His gray cleaning cart remained beside him, a fresh mop resting neatly against the bucket as though this extraordinary moment were interrupting nothing more than another ordinary shift. Charlotte opened the case slowly. Gasps drifted through the crowd as the amount became visible. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice steady although her heartbeat refused to cooperate, "my family owes you more than words can ever repay. Please accept this." The room held its breath. Someone quietly lifted a phone to record what everyone assumed would become the feel-good headline of the week. Ethan looked at the check for only a second before gently closing the case with both hands. His expression never changed. "Keep it," he said softly. "There are people who need it more than I do." Silence spread across the marble floor faster than sound ever could. Charlotte blinked once, convinced she had misunderstood him. "I'm serious," she replied. "This isn't charity. It's gratitude." Ethan offered the same calm smile that many employees had seen every morning without ever truly noticing. Gratitude doesn't have a price tag. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Even the security guards standing near the revolving doors exchanged uncertain glances. Charlotte had spent her entire life watching. People compete for invitations, promotions, investments, inheritances, and opportunities that carried the Beaumont name. She had seen strangers flatter her father for a fraction of this amount. Yet the one man who had earned every penny refused to touch it. It made no sense. Outside, late autumn sunlight spilled across the city streets while yellow leaves drifted lazily between passing taxis. Inside, the fluorescent lights reflected across the spotless floor Ethan had polished before sunrise. He glanced toward the windows as though admiring nothing more than another beautiful morning. "If you'll excuse me," he said politely, "the west hallway still needs to be finished before the afternoon meetings begin." Before anyone could stop him, he picked up the mop, adjusted the worn gloves on his hands, and quietly rolled his cleaning cart away from the stunned gathering. The wheels squeaked softly against the marble, growing fainter with every step. Charlotte remained frozen where she stood, the unopened reward still resting in her hands. For the first time in her privileged life, she realized she had just met a man who could not be impressed by wealth, and somewhere deep inside her heart, a question began to echo louder than the applause that never came. Who was Ethan Walker, and what kind of life teaches a man to walk away from a fortune without looking back? Ethan Walker never hurried, because he had learned years ago that peace could not be found by running faster than life. Long before the first executive stepped through the revolving doors each morning, he was already inside Beaumont Global headquarters with a warm cup of black coffee resting on the corner of his cleaning cart. At exactly 5:30 every weekday, he unlocked the maintenance closet, checked every supply with quiet precision, and began polishing the marble floors that thousands of expensive shoes would cross before sunset. He greeted the security officers by name. He remembered which receptionist preferred vanilla creamer and which elevator technician was expecting his first grandson. Most employees smiled politely when they passed him, yet very few ever stopped long enough to ask about the man behind the uniform. That never seemed to bother Ethan. His dignity had never depended on being noticed. By 3 o'clock every afternoon, his shift ended, but his day was far from over. He drove an aging blue pickup truck that had more than 200,000 miles on the odometer through quiet neighborhoods lined with maple trees until he reached a modest white house with a weathered front porch. Waiting there almost every day was 12-year-old Lily Walker, her backpack leaning against the front steps and a paperback novel tucked beneath one arm. The moment she heard the familiar engine, her face brightened with the kind of smile that money could never manufacture. "How was school?" Ethan asked as she climbed into the passenger seat. "Math was hard," Lily admitted with a laugh. "But I survived." Ethan smiled. "That is how champions begin." They stopped at a neighborhood grocery store where Lily carefully compared prices before choosing ingredients for dinner. She had learned early that stretching $1 was not something to fear. It was simply another way of showing gratitude for what they had. Back home, father and daughter cooked together in a small kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of tomato soup, grilled cheese sandwiches, and fresh herbs growing in flower pots beside the window. Above the dining table hung a framed photograph of Lily's late mother, Hannah, smiling beneath a summer sky with the same gentle eyes that Lily had inherited. Ethan looked at the photograph every evening, never with bitterness, only with quiet remembrance. After dinner, Lily spread her homework across the table while Ethan repaired a loose cabinet hinge that had been squeaking for weeks. "Dad," Lily asked without looking up from her history assignment, "if someone offered you $1 million, what would you do?" Ethan paused, setting the screwdriver on the counter before answering. "I would ask whether accepting it would change who I am." Lily tilted her head thoughtfully. "And if it did?" Ethan smiled softly. "Then it would cost more than it was worth." Lily nodded as though the answer made perfect sense. Outside, rain began tapping gently against the windows while warm lamplight filled the little house with a quiet glow. Across the city, Charlotte Beaumont sat alone in her penthouse office, the unopened leather case still resting on her desk exactly where she had placed it hours earlier. She replayed the scene again and again, searching for an explanation that refused to appear. Every lesson she had ever learned about success, influence, and wealth suddenly felt incomplete. Somewhere between polished marble floors and a humble dinner table, two completely different worlds had crossed paths, and neither of them would ever see life quite the same way again. The next morning arrived wrapped in a blanket of silver clouds that softened the skyline above downtown Chicago, but Charlotte Beaumont barely noticed the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office. The unopened leather case remained exactly where she had left it the evening before, resting on the edge of her conference table like an unanswered question. She had spent years negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, reading people within minutes, and predicting what almost anyone wanted before they spoke. Yet one quiet janitor had undone every assumption she carried without raising his voice once. She closed her laptop, canceled 2 executive meetings, and walked downstairs without informing anyone. The familiar hum of elevators mixed with the distant tapping of keyboards and the gentle murmur of conversations drifting through the lobby. Ethan Walker was already there, guiding his mop across the polished marble in long, careful strokes that reflected the morning light like a calm lake. He worked with the same steady rhythm as always, never glancing around to see who might be watching. Charlotte stopped several feet away, unnoticed for a moment, and observed something she had never paid attention to before. A young receptionist hurried past carrying an overloaded stack of folders. One slipped free and scattered papers across the floor. Before anyone else reacted, Ethan quietly leaned his mop against the cart, knelt beside her, and helped gather every page without saying a word about the inconvenience. "Thank you," the young woman said, embarrassed. Ethan simply smiled. Everyone has busy mornings. Minutes later, an elderly delivery driver entered the building pushing a heavy cart of office supplies. One wheel caught on the edge of the entrance mat. Ethan walked over, lifted the front slightly, and guided it inside before returning to his own work as though nothing unusual had happened. There was no audience applauding, no manager taking notes, and certainly no expectation of recognition. Charlotte remained where she was, watching a pattern begin to emerge. He noticed people others overlooked. Around noon she visited the employee cafeteria, something she almost never did. Carrying a simple bowl of soup instead of a catered lunch, she chose a table near the back where few employees recognized her without the formal conference room setting. Across the room, Ethan entered carrying a plain brown paper lunch bag. He greeted the kitchen staff by name, filled a paper cup with water, and sat alone near the windows. Before he even opened his sandwich, a nervous young intern approached his table. "Mr. Walker," the young man asked quietly, "do you mind if I sit here?" Ethan looked up with a warm expression. "There is always room." The intern sighed. "I think I made a mistake on my first project." Everyone seems disappointed. Ethan listened without interrupting. When the young man finished speaking, Ethan folded his hands and smiled gently. One mistake does not decide who you become. The next decision does. The intern laughed softly, the worry easing from his face. "I needed to hear that." Ethan nodded. "Someone once told me the same thing." Charlotte looked down at her untouched soup. In boardrooms she had watched executives compete to sound brilliant. This janitor spoke fewer words than anyone she knew, yet somehow people walked away feeling lighter after every conversation. As Ethan gathered his lunch bag and returned to work, Charlotte realized she was no longer curious about why he had refused a reward. She had begun wondering how a man with so little could quietly give so much, and for the first time in many years, she found herself hoping the answer would change her more than it changed him. Charlotte Beaumont had built her reputation on finding answers hidden beneath numbers, contracts, and polished presentations, but Ethan Walker refused to fit inside any pattern she understood. Over the next several days she quietly adjusted her schedule, arriving before sunrise more than once simply to watch the building wake up around him. The city outside stretched into another crisp autumn morning as commuters hurried through the revolving doors carrying coffee cups and briefcases, their footsteps echoing across the marble lobby that Ethan had already transformed into a mirror of soft light. He greeted every person with the same gentle nod whether they wore an expensive tailored suit or a delivery uniform dusted with cardboard fibers. Rank never seemed to matter to him. Position never changed his kindness. Charlotte stood near the reception desk pretending to review emails while secretly observing another ordinary morning that somehow felt extraordinary. A maintenance technician accidentally dropped a box of light bulbs, and dozens rolled across the floor. Before frustration could settle into the room, Ethan calmly walked over, picked them up one by one, and smiled. "Nobody plans to have an accident," he said. "That is why patience exists." The technician laughed with relief. "You always know the right thing to say." Ethan shook his head. "I only try to say the helpful thing." Those words stayed with Charlotte long after he returned to his cart. Later that afternoon she asked the Human Resources Director to bring her Ethan's employment file. The folder was surprisingly thin. 12 years with Beaumont Global. Perfect attendance except for a few days when his daughter had been hospitalized with pneumonia years earlier. Outstanding evaluations. No disciplinary actions. No requests for promotion. No complaints. No special recognition either. It was as though he had quietly existed between the lines of the company without asking anyone to notice. Charlotte closed the folder slowly. "Has nobody ever nominated him for an employee award?" she asked. The director looked genuinely surprised. "Mr. Walker usually asks us to recognize someone else instead. Last year he recommended one of the night security guards. The year before that he suggested the cafeteria staff." Charlotte leaned back in silence. She had spent years encouraging leadership seminars that taught influence, teamwork, and service, yet the man who practiced those values most consistently had never attended a single executive workshop. That evening she found Ethan replacing fresh flowers in the small memorial corner near the lobby where employees honored colleagues who had passed away over the years. "You buy those yourself?" she asked quietly. Ethan turned with a gentle smile. "Fresh flowers remind people that love continues growing." Charlotte glanced at the simple bouquet. The company does not reimburse you? Ethan gave a small shrug. Some things are worth more when nobody is keeping score. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The soft hum of the ventilation system drifted through the nearly empty building while golden sunlight faded across the glass walls. Charlotte finally looked at him and asked the question that had been following her since the day he closed the leather case. Have you really never wanted more? Ethan rested one hand on the handle of his cleaning cart and looked toward the glowing skyline beyond the windows. Of course I have, he answered honestly. I wanted more time with my wife. I wanted my daughter to grow up with her mother. I wanted one more ordinary day that life could not give back. After losing those things, I learned to be careful about confusing what is valuable with what is expensive. Charlotte lowered her eyes, unable to answer. She had inherited unimaginable wealth, yet in a few quiet sentences, a janitor had revealed a kind of richness that no balance sheet could ever measure, and for the first time she began to wonder whether the greatest fortune in the building had never belonged to the Beaumont family at all. The following Saturday arrived with clear blue skies and a cool breeze that carried the scent of fallen leaves through the quiet neighborhood where Ethan and Lily lived. For the first weekend in months, Charlotte Beaumont left behind her driver, her assistant, and the polished routine that had defined her life for years. Dressed in simple jeans and a light sweater, she parked several houses away, hoping no one would recognize her. She had not come to inspect, judge, or interfere. She simply wanted to understand the man who seemed to measure success by an entirely different standard. From a respectful distance, she watched Ethan load several cardboard boxes into the back of his old pickup truck while Lily carefully arranged homemade muffins inside reusable containers. Do not forget Mrs. Henderson likes the blueberry ones, Lily reminded her father with a smile. Ethan laughed softly. I would never survive if I forgot Mrs. Henderson's favorite. Curious, Charlotte followed discreetly as the pickup drove across town to a small community center attached to an old neighborhood church. There were no television cameras waiting outside. No reporters. No company photographers. Volunteers greeted Ethan by name as though he had been part of their family for years. Without ceremony, he carried boxes filled with canned food, winter coats, and school supplies into the building. An elderly volunteer thanked him. You brought too much again. Ethan smiled. Someone once brought enough for my family when we needed it. I am only returning the favor. Before Charlotte could absorb those words, another scene quietly unfolded. A little boy sitting alone in the corner struggled to assemble a model airplane that had broken during the week's after-school program. Ethan knelt beside him, carefully fitting the small plastic pieces together while explaining each step with patient encouragement. Sometimes things come apart, he said gently. That does not mean they cannot become beautiful again. The boy's eyes brightened as the tiny airplane finally rested on its wheels. He hugged Ethan without hesitation before running off to show his friends. Ethan never looked around to see whether anyone had noticed. He simply stood, dusted off his hands, and continued stacking food on the shelves. Charlotte remained near the entrance, overwhelmed by how naturally kindness seemed to flow through every ordinary moment of his life. It was not a performance. It was simply who he was. Later that afternoon, Ethan and Lily stopped at a small hardware store where an elderly widow struggled to carry several bags of garden soil to her car. Ethan lifted them with an easy smile. Your roses will appreciate this. The woman laughed warmly. You always remember my flowers. Lily grinned. Dad remembers everybody. As the widow drove away, Charlotte found herself smiling without realizing it. She had spent years believing influence came from power, titles, and financial resources. Yet everywhere Ethan went, people felt lighter simply because he was present. That evening, after returning home, Charlotte sat alone on the balcony outside her penthouse overlooking thousands of glittering city lights. The skyline had never seemed so magnificent or so strangely empty. She thought about the community center, the little boy, the elderly widow, and the quiet joy on Lily's face as she worked beside her father. None of those moments had cost millions of dollars. None required a corporate strategy or public recognition. They only required a heart willing to notice someone else's need. As the city settled into silence beneath the stars, Charlotte finally admitted something she had never imagined possible. She was no longer trying to discover Ethan Walker's secret. She was beginning to question the life she herself had been living, and that realization would become the first step toward a transformation neither of them could yet foresee. Monday morning arrived with a gentle rain that turned the city streets into ribbons of silver beneath the glowing traffic lights. Beaumont Global headquarters slowly filled with employees shaking umbrellas dry before stepping into the warm lobby, but Charlotte Beaumont was already waiting inside. She had made a decision over the weekend. If she truly wanted to understand Ethan Walker, she needed to stop observing him from a distance and start listening. Near the end of his morning shift, she approached him as he carefully arranged fresh chairs inside a conference room after an early executive meeting. "Would you have lunch with me?" she asked. Ethan looked slightly surprised before offering the same calm smile she had come to recognize. "Lunch sounds nice, Miss Beaumont, but only if we eat in the employee cafeteria." "I packed a sandwich." Charlotte hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Then the cafeteria it is." Word spread quietly through the building as executives watched the billionaire's daughter carry a simple lunch tray instead of ordering a catered meal. Ethan unwrapped his homemade turkey sandwich while Charlotte stirred a bowl of vegetable soup that suddenly seemed far more satisfying than any expensive restaurant reservation. For a few minutes they spoke about ordinary things. The changing weather. Lily's upcoming science fair. The maple trees beginning to lose their leaves. Then Charlotte asked the question she had been carrying for days. "Were you always a janitor?" Ethan smiled softly and shook his head. "No. Years ago I worked as a mechanical engineer for a manufacturing company outside Chicago. I loved designing machines because every problem had a solution if you stayed patient long enough." Charlotte looked at him with genuine surprise. "Why did you leave?" Ethan rested his hands around his paper coffee cup before answering. "My wife became seriously ill. Between hospital visits, caring for Lily, and trying to keep our family together, the long hours became impossible. Eventually I resigned because there were more important things than promotions." His voice remained steady, yet every word carried quiet weight. "After Hannah passed away, I accepted the first stable job I could find with health insurance and predictable hours. Beaumont Global gave me both. That schedule allowed me to raise my daughter myself." Charlotte lowered her eyes. "Did you ever regret it?" Ethan looked toward the cafeteria window where light rain traced gentle paths across the glass. "I regret losing my wife every single day. I have never regretted choosing my family." Silence settled comfortably between them. Around them the cafeteria buzzed with conversations, the sound of trays sliding across counters, and the soft aroma of fresh coffee drifting through the room. None of it disturbed the peaceful honesty of the moment. Charlotte finally spoke again. "Most people would call that a sacrifice." Ethan smiled. "Love rarely feels like a sacrifice while you are living it. It only looks that way to people watching from the outside." Those words lingered long after lunch ended. That afternoon Charlotte quietly contacted one of the retired executives who had worked at the manufacturing company where Ethan once designed industrial equipment. The elderly man answered her questions with unmistakable admiration. "Walker," he laughed warmly. "He was one of the brightest engineers I ever supervised. We all assumed he would become vice president one day. But when his family needed him, he walked away without a complaint. He never blamed anyone. He simply chose what mattered most." Charlotte ended the call and sat silently in her office overlooking the city. For years she had admired people who climbed higher than everyone else. Now she found herself deeply moved by a man who had willingly stepped down so someone he loved would never have to stand alone, and she realized that true greatness was not measured by the height of a career but by the depth of a person's character. The days that followed brought changes so quiet that most people inside Beaumont Global never noticed them, but to those who paid attention, something remarkable had begun to unfold. Charlotte Beaumont no longer rushed through the lobby with a phone pressed to her ear while assistants hurried behind her. Instead, she arrived a little earlier each morning, carrying her own coffee and greeting the reception staff by name. She paused to ask the security guards how their families were doing. She thanked the maintenance crew before stepping into the elevator. At first, employees assumed the change was temporary, another leadership initiative that would disappear after a few weeks. But the kindness continued, not because someone instructed her to practice it, but because she had witnessed what genuine respect looked like through the quiet example of one ordinary man. Ethan never commented on the difference. He simply continued his work with the same calm rhythm that had become the heartbeat of the building. One afternoon Charlotte walked through the lobby and found Ethan helping Lily with a small display board covered in colorful diagrams and neatly handwritten notes. "Science fair?" Charlotte asked with a smile. Lily nodded proudly. "I built a water filtration model from recycled materials." Ethan looked at his daughter with unmistakable pride. "She designed every part herself. I only held the flashlight while she worked." Charlotte studied the display with sincere interest. "It is impressive." Lily smiled. "Thank you. Dad says solving problems is easier when you care about the people the solution helps." Charlotte glanced toward Ethan. "That sounds like something an engineer would say." Ethan laughed softly. "Old habits stay with us." A comfortable silence settled around them before Charlotte surprised herself by asking, "Would you both join me for dinner one evening?" "Nothing formal. Just a neighborhood restaurant." Lily looked at her father with hopeful eyes, waiting for his answer. Ethan hesitated for only a moment. "As long as we split the bill." Charlotte laughed for the first time in days. "I had a feeling you might say that." A week later they met at a small family-owned diner far from downtown where no one paid attention to last names or business titles. The scent of fresh baked bread and homemade apple pie filled the warm dining room while soft country music played in the background. Lily talked excitedly about school, books, and her dream of becoming an environmental engineer. Charlotte listened more than she spoke, smiling as Ethan encouraged every one of his daughter's ideas with quiet confidence instead of impossible expectations. Watching them together stirred something deep within her heart. She had attended elegant charity galas, exclusive banquets, and private dinners with world leaders, yet none of those evenings carried the warmth she felt sitting inside this simple restaurant beneath yellow lights and framed photographs of local families. As they stepped outside after dinner, a cool autumn breeze carried golden leaves across the sidewalk. Charlotte looked at Ethan. "Your daughter is extraordinary." Ethan smiled with gentle gratitude. "She teaches me something every day." Charlotte lowered her voice. "I used to believe success meant having people admire you. Now I think it might mean helping someone become the best version of themselves." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "The people who change the world are usually changed first." Charlotte stood quietly beneath the glowing street lamp, realizing those words described her own journey better than anything she could have said herself. She had started searching for the reason a humble janitor refused a fortune, but somewhere along the way she had found something far more valuable. Without realizing it, she had begun building a life that looked a little less like the one she inherited and a little more like the one she truly wanted to live. The first snow of the season arrived earlier than expected, dusting the streets of Chicago with a thin white blanket that softened the noise of the city and turned Beaumont Global headquarters into a picture of quiet elegance. Inside the executive boardroom, however, the atmosphere carried a different kind of anticipation. Richard Beaumont had finally returned from a month of overseas meetings, and the first item on his agenda was not a merger, a financial report, or an investment strategy. It was Ethan Walker. Charlotte sat beside her father as senior executives quietly reviewed the remarkable story that had spread throughout the company. Richard listened without interrupting, occasionally glancing toward his daughter, whose expression had changed more over the past month than it had in years. When the presentation ended, the billionaire closed the folder and smiled thoughtfully. "Invite Mr. Walker upstairs." A few minutes later Ethan entered the boardroom wearing the same neatly pressed maintenance uniform he wore every morning. He looked around the polished walnut table, nodded respectfully, and waited without the slightest sign of nervousness. Richard stood and extended his hand. "Mr. Walker, I have wanted to meet the man who refused a reward that most people would spend a lifetime pursuing." Ethan shook his hand with quiet confidence. "It is a pleasure to meet you, sir." Richard gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Please, sit down." Ethan remained standing. "Thank you, but I am comfortable here." A few executives exchanged curious glances. Richard smiled even wider. "Very well. I have spent several weeks learning about your work, your family, and the respect you have earned throughout this company. I believe someone with your engineering background and your character belongs in leadership. I would like to offer you a position overseeing our National Facilities Division. The salary is more than 10 times your current income. There is also a company house, full benefits, and complete financial security for you and your daughter." Silence settled over the room. Charlotte watched Ethan carefully, remembering the leather case he had quietly closed weeks before. Richard continued gently. "This is not charity. It is an opportunity you have earned." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at the billionaire. "Your generosity honors me more than I can express." Richard nodded. "Then I hope you will accept." Ethan smiled with genuine gratitude, but there was unmistakable peace in his eyes. "I cannot." The room became perfectly still. One executive slowly removed his glasses as though he had misheard the answer. Richard leaned forward, surprised but not offended. "May I ask why?" Ethan folded his hands calmly. "Because accepting a position simply because I impressed the owner's family would send the wrong message to everyone who has worked honestly toward that opportunity. If I ever return to engineering, I want it to be because I earned the role through the same process every other employee follows. My daughter has watched every decision I have made since she was little. I want her to believe that integrity matters even when nobody would blame you for choosing differently." Charlotte felt her eyes begin to glisten. No speech at any leadership conference had ever carried the quiet power of those simple words. Richard remained silent for several seconds before slowly rising from his chair. He walked around the table, stopped in front of Ethan, and extended his hand once more. "Mr. Walker," he said softly, "today you have taught an old businessman something money could never buy." Ethan accepted the handshake with humble gratitude. As he quietly left the boardroom carrying nothing except the same worn work gloves he had arrived with, nobody spoke. The only sound in the room was the gentle snowfall brushing against the tall windows, while every person present realized they had just witnessed the rare kind of wealth that could never be written on any balance sheet. Christmas arrived wrapped in quiet snowfall, covering rooftops and sidewalks with a gentle layer of white that made even the busiest streets seem to breathe a little slower. Beaumont Global Headquarters closed early that afternoon, and for the first time in many years, Richard Beaumont canceled every remaining business appointment. Instead, he invited a small group of employees and their families to a simple holiday gathering in the company atrium. There were no reporters, no photographers, and no carefully planned speeches. There were only warm lights, fresh pine garlands, homemade cookies from the cafeteria staff, and a piano softly filling the room with familiar Christmas melodies. Ethan Walker entered holding Lily's hand, both of them dressed in modest winter coats still dusted with snowflakes. Charlotte greeted them with the same genuine smile she now offered everyone who walked through the doors. Lily admired the towering Christmas tree standing beneath the glass ceiling while Ethan quietly thanked the cafeteria team for preparing the meal. As the evening unfolded, employees laughed together without worrying about job titles or corner offices. Executives sat beside maintenance workers. Receptionists shared stories with department directors. Somehow the invisible walls that had once separated everyone seemed to have disappeared. Later that evening, Richard gently tapped a glass to gather everyone's attention. The conversations faded into silence as he looked across the room before speaking. "This year I believed I would be teaching our company about leadership," he said with a humble smile. "Instead, leadership found us wearing work gloves and pushing a cleaning cart." Soft laughter filled the room. Richard continued. "Because of one man's example, we have created a new tradition. Beginning next year, every employee will receive paid volunteer days to serve their own communities, and every promotion inside this company will measure character alongside performance. We build successful businesses, but from this day forward, we will also build stronger people." Warm applause filled the atrium, but Ethan lowered his eyes, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. Charlotte quietly stepped beside him. "You changed all of this without trying." Ethan smiled gently. People were ready to change. They only needed someone to remind them what mattered. After the gathering ended, Charlotte asked Ethan and Lily if they would walk with her outside. Snow continued falling beneath the glow of the city lights as the three of them crossed the nearly empty plaza. The world seemed unusually peaceful. Charlotte looked toward Lily first. "Your father once refused a reward because he believed integrity could not be purchased." Lily smiled proudly. "That sounds like my dad." Charlotte laughed softly before turning to Ethan. "I finally understand why." She reached into her coat pocket, not to offer another check or another position, but to remove a small handwritten Christmas card. Inside was a single message. "Thank you for teaching me how to measure a successful life." Ethan read the words slowly before closing the card with the same care he had once used to close the leather case. "This," he said quietly, "is a gift I can gladly accept." Charlotte's eyes filled with grateful tears, not from sadness but from the quiet joy of finally understanding that the greatest rewards are never counted in dollars. They are found in respect freely given, kindness quietly shared, and hearts willing to grow. As they stood together beneath the falling snow, Lily slipped her hand into Charlotte's without saying a word. Charlotte looked down, gently squeezed her hand, and smiled. Ethan watched the simple moment with peaceful gratitude. He had never searched for wealth, recognition, or admiration. He had only tried to live each ordinary day with dignity, grace, and love. In the end, those quiet choices accomplished what no fortune ever could. They transformed a family, renewed a company, and reminded everyone who crossed their path that the richest people in the world are often the ones who never need to prove it.